I sometimes wonder if silence is its own kind of lie. Not the dramatic kind, not a deliberate deception, but the quiet, accumulated kind that builds up over years, until one day you look around and realize no one actually knows who you are anymore. At 63, I've had a lot of time to think about that. My name is Margaret Calloway, and I spent most of the last 6 years becoming invisible. It didn't happen all at once. That's never how it works. It happened the way a sweater unravels one small pull at a time until you're holding nothing but loose threads and wondering where the whole thing went. My husband Patrick died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago, 11 weeks after diagnosis. 11 weeks. We didn't even have time to say everything we should have said. We had 34 years together, most of them spent in the same house in Oakville, Ontario, the one with the red door and the garden that Patrick always insisted on planting himself, even though his knees gave him trouble from the second decade onward. After he died, the house felt enormous. Not in a freeing way, in the way that a room feels enormous when something important has been taken out of it. Our son Daniel was 31 when Patrick passed. He was already established by then, working as a project manager for an engineering firm in Toronto, 40 minutes up the highway, but somehow always farther than that. He handled his father's death the way he handled most difficult things, by staying very busy and talking about it as little as possible. I understood. Some people grieve loudly. Daniel has always been quiet about the things that hurt him the most. He got that from his father. 2 years later, Daniel married a woman named Yuki Tanaka. She was thoughtful, reserved, accomplished, a research analyst who had grown up in Vancouver with her parents and younger brother before moving to Toronto for graduate school. Her family was warm in that particular way that takes time to reveal itself, not immediately effusive but deeply loyal once you were inside the circle. The trouble was I couldn't quite tell if I was inside the circle or just standing near it. I was happy for Daniel. Genuinely, completely happy. Yuki was exactly the kind of person I would have chosen for him if that had been my role to play, which of course it wasn't. But somewhere in the months after their wedding, I started feeling like a background detail in a painting, technically present, but not something anyone actually looked at. It wasn't malicious. I want to be clear about that. No one was unkind. Yuki always asked after my health. Daniel always said he'd come by soon, but weeks would pass and the phone would stay quiet. And I'd find myself having whole conversations with the cat just to hear something answer back. I had not told Daniel about Osaka. I'm not sure why, except that by the time it might have mattered, it felt like ancient history, like telling someone about a dream you'd had years ago, technically true, but somehow beside the point. I was 24 when I went. I just finished my degree in East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto, which was a perfectly interesting degree that led to approximately no obvious career path, and I had a vague plan to travel and figure the rest out later. A professor connected me with a language school in Osaka that needed native English speakers, and I said yes before I had fully thought through what yes meant. I stayed for 9 years. I learned Japanese the way you can only learn a language when you have no real alternative, through embarrassment and repetition, and the particular humility of being completely dependent on the goodwill of strangers. I became fluent, not just in the standard form, but in the Kansai dialect, the rougher, warmer version that marks you as someone who actually lived there, rather than someone who studied there. I made friends who became family. I ate things I couldn't name and loved most of them. I taught English to business people and children and elderly women who wanted to read Jane Austen in the original, and I learned more from all of them than I ever gave back. Then I met Patrick at a conference in Kyoto. He was there representing a Canadian construction company on some kind of trade delegation, looking slightly overwhelmed by everything and endearingly honest about it. We talked for 3 hours at a reception neither of us had wanted to attend. He came back to Osaka the following weekend, then the weekend after that. 8 months later, I packed up my apartment near Shinsaibashi, said goodbye to 9 years of a life I had built from nothing, and came home to Canada. I never regretted it, but I also never talked about it much. Patrick knew, obviously. He loved hearing the stories, especially in the early years. But as time went on and life filled in all the available space, that version of me, the young woman who'd navigated a foreign city alone, who'd bargained at Kuromon Market and known every shortcut in Namba, started to feel like someone I'd read about, rather than someone I'd been. Daniel knew I had lived in Japan. He knew I'd studied Japanese in university. He did not know I was still fluent. It had simply never come up. And there's a particular moment in every long silence where breaking it starts to feel stranger than maintaining it. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning in early October. Daniel, which was unusual enough that I let it ring twice to make sure I was reading the name right. "Hey, Mum, how are you doing?" He sounded like he was walking somewhere, the particular acoustics of someone on a downtown Toronto sidewalk. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. Actually, I'm calling because Yuki's family is coming in from Vancouver next weekend. Her parents and her brother Kenji's visiting from Tokyo, which is kind of a big deal because he doesn't travel much. They want to do a family dinner Saturday night at Yuki's parents' place, and Yuki thought, well, we both thought it would be nice if you came." I waited. There was something careful in the way he was phrasing it. "We're also having dinner with a potential business contact of Kenji's. A man named Hiroshi Saito, who's based in Toronto and looking to connect with Canadian engineering firms about some infrastructure projects. It could be a real opportunity. Kenji knows him socially and thought the dinner setting might be less formal, better for conversation. And you'd like me there to round out the family picture?" There was a pause. "Mom, it's not like that. We just haven't all been together in a while, and Yuki's parents have asked about you. They want to meet you properly." Something in his voice told me he believed what he was saying, even if it wasn't the whole story. And the truth was I hadn't seen Daniel in 6 weeks. 6 weeks is a long time when your days are quiet. "What time should I be there?" 7. "And maybe wear something I don't know." Nice. Yuki's mom takes that kind of thing seriously. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, looking at the African violet on the windowsill that Patrick had given me the last Christmas he was well enough to shop for presents. I had kept it alive through 4 Ontario winters, which felt like its own small act of stubbornness. I had not spoken Japanese to another person in nearly 2 years. I sometimes read I kept a subscription to an online newspaper out of habit more than anything, and occasionally found myself thinking in it when I was tired or distracted. The way you think in whatever language lives deepest in your brain. But spoken Japanese? Conversational Japanese? The kind you use with people from Osaka who speak fast and drop syllables that I hadn't used in a long time. I wasn't worried. Language doesn't leave you, not the kind you've lived in. Saturday came with the particular crispness that October brings to southern Ontario, that smell of cold and dead leaves that I have never fully decided whether I love or simply associate too strongly with endings. I drove to Yuki's parents' home in Mississauga, a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood that spoke of a family who had worked steadily and well for a long time and were proud of it in a way they'd never say out loud. Yuki's mother, whom I knew only slightly from the wedding, answered the door. Her name was Noriko. She was elegant and precise, the kind of woman who made everything look considered. She smiled warmly, took my coat, told me I looked lovely, and guided me through to the living room where voices were already competing for space. The house smelled wonderful, dashi and something sweet, and the particular warm smell of a home where real cooking had been happening all day. I felt something unknot slightly in my chest. Yuki appeared at my elbow almost immediately, which I thought was kind of her. She was wearing a deep green dress and looked both beautiful and slightly nervous in the way people look when they're managing several competing priorities at once. "Linda," she had always called me by my first name, which I didn't mind. "So glad you're here. Let me introduce you to everyone." I followed her into the room. Yuki's father, Hiroshi, was a quiet man with a firm handshake and the air of someone who listened more than he spoke. Her brother Kenji was in his late 30s, sharper looking than his father, with the slightly restless energy of someone who traveled constantly and was always mentally in 3 places at once. And the business contact, whose name was also Hiroshi Saito, was probably in his mid-50s, immaculately dressed, with the particular composed quality of someone who had learned to reveal very little in professional settings. Daniel was already there, looking relieved to see me. He hugged me properly, which he didn't always remember to do in groups. Everyone was introduced. Hands were shaken. I was placed, with great courtesy, in a chair that was slightly outside the main conversational orbit. Not excluded, just peripheral. The comfortable chair you put the grandmother in, positioned to observe rather than participate. I accepted a cup of tea and settled in. The conversation moved fluidly between English and Japanese. Noriko and her husband spoke English well but preferred Japanese when talking to each other or to Kenji, which was natural and understandable. Hiroshi Saito spoke excellent English, the precise, slightly formal kind that comes from years of conducting business internationally. Daniel and Yuki translated occasionally for Daniel's benefit, and he nodded along gamely. I said nothing. I kept my face pleasantly neutral and sipped my tea and listened. What I heard? Once the English portions of conversation gave way more fully to Japanese, once everyone had apparently concluded that the older Canadian woman in the corner needed no further managing, was considerably more interesting than what I had been shown. Noriko said to her husband quietly but not in a whisper that she was pleased the dinner was coming together, but she did wish Daniel would show more attentiveness to his mother. Look at her sitting there alone, she said. He brought her, but he's barely spoken to her. In Japan this would be embarrassing. Her husband said he wasn't sure what to make of the family situation. Daniel seemed capable enough, but there was something about a man who didn't keep his family close. It made you wonder. Kenji said something to Saito-san that made me set down my tea very carefully. He said in the relaxed, rapid Kansai-inflected Japanese he used with someone he trusted that he liked Daniel. Daniel was a good professional, but the mother was an unknown quantity. Difficult to read. She'd barely said a word all evening. It was hard to know what to make of a family where the mother sat like a visitor at her own son's dinner. Saito, who had been listening with his characteristic stillness, said quietly that he'd noticed the same thing. That in his experience, the character of a man's family revealed something about the character of the man. He hadn't decided yet what this revealed. My hands were absolutely steady. I was proud of that. What I was also thinking, with the part of my brain that had gone very calm and focused, was that my son's professional opportunity which mattered to him, which he had brought me here to support, was quietly unraveling in a language everyone assumed I couldn't understand. Kenji trusted Saito. Saito trusted Kenji's read of the room. And the room contained a woman sitting quietly in a corner looking like she had nothing to contribute, which I'd been letting people believe for 6 years. Noriko spoke again to her husband, in a lowered voice, but still quite audible to me. She said she felt for the woman, honestly. She seemed lonely, but there was something she searched for the word very Canadian about it. This expectation that everyone should be self-sufficient, that needing family was weakness. My Yuki, she said, she would never let her parents sit like that. She had been raised knowing what family required. I looked at my teacup. I thought about Patrick. I thought about 9 years in Osaka. I thought about all the times in the past 4 years I had said, I'm fine, don't worry about me, you two are busy. I've got plenty going on and meant none of it, and no, none of it was being questioned too closely because it was easier for everyone if it was true. The dinner table had been laid in the dining room, and Noriko was beginning to move people in that direction. It was, I thought, now or considerably later. And considerably later was not really an option that served anyone well. I set down my teacup. I turned toward Noriko and in the Kansai dialect, in the voice of someone who had learned Japanese in the markets and restaurants and cramped teachers' rooms of Osaka and kept it for 35 years like something too useful to discard, I said, Noriko-san, please allow me to help you with anything before we sit down. The room went very quiet, not the polite transitional quiet of a gathering moving from one space to another. A different kind of quiet entirely. The kind where everyone becomes suddenly and completely still. Noriko turned and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face a person makes when the ground has shifted under them in a way they cannot immediately account for. Kenji's eyebrows rose. He looked at his sister. Yuki's expression moved through about 6 distinct phases in 3 seconds. Daniel looked from his wife to me with the particular confusion of someone who has understood almost nothing of what just happened, but grasps that it is significant. Saito said nothing. He simply watched. I stood up from my peripheral chair and came properly into the room. I apologize, I said in Japanese, for not announcing this sooner. It wasn't meant to be deceptive. I just didn't know when it would be relevant. But I've been listening this evening, and I think some things need to be said, if you'll allow me. Noriko found her voice. You speak Japanese? I lived in Osaka for 9 years, I said. I taught English there when I was young, near Shinsaibashi. I learned the Kansai dialect from people who had no patience for the standard version. Kenji made a sound that might have been a laugh. His hand went briefly over his mouth. Saito's expression had shifted into something I couldn't fully read: attention, certainly, and maybe reassessment. I turned towards Saito and Kenji, because this was the part that mattered most. I said, "I want to address something directly. I understand that what you've observed this evening has raised questions about my son's relationship with his family, and I understand why. What you've seen isn't wrong exactly, but it's also not the full picture." I paused. I had not spoken this much Japanese in 2 years, and I was conscious of choosing carefully, not because the words weren't there, but because I wanted them to be accurate. "Daniel has not failed to keep me close," I said. I made myself unavailable. After my husband died, I decided I told myself it was consideration, but I think it was actually fear that I should not require anything from Daniel and Yuki, that they were building their life and I would be a burden. So I said I was fine when I wasn't. I said I didn't need anything when I needed quite a lot, and everyone got comfortable with that version of the story because it was convenient. I looked at Noriko. "You said something a few minutes ago that I want to respond to. You said there's something very Canadian about expecting people to be self-sufficient. I think you're right, and I think I took that cultural tendency much further than was healthy or honest. It isn't strength. It's just a different kind of avoidance." Noriko's hand had come up to her mouth. Her husband was very still. I turned back to Saito. "Daniel is a good man who trusts the people around him and works hard and honors his commitments. If he has a fault, it's that he believed me when I told him I didn't need anything. That's not a flaw in his character. It's a flaw in my communication. And it would be a significant injustice if a professional opportunity fell apart because of a misreading of a situation I created." The silence that followed was the longest kind, the kind with weight to it. Then Saito said, slowly, in Japanese, "You lived in Osaka, Kansai dialect, 9 years. The best years of my youth," I said. "Also, the most disorganizing. It's a city that gets into you." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. He said, "I grew up in Kyoto. We thought Osaka people were too loud." "They are," I said. "I fit right in." Kenji laughed outright. It broke something open in the room. Noriko came to me then, across the dining room in 3 quick steps, and took both my hands. She spoke in Japanese and then shifted to English as though wanting to be sure I understood the sincerity of it. She said she was sorry, that she had made assumptions, that she could see, now, who I was, and she was ashamed of what she'd said about me in a language she'd believed I couldn't understand. "There's nothing to be ashamed of," I said. "You were reading what I was showing you." "I wasn't showing you very much." Yuki appeared beside her mother. Her eyes were bright. She said quietly, in English, that she had wanted to know me better and hadn't known how to ask, that she'd assumed I preferred my distance, that she'd felt uncertain about whether she was welcome to try. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman I had been politely keeping at arm's length for 2 years, while privately wanting nothing more than to be included, and I said, "I would love for you to try." I'm sorry it took this long for me to say that clearly. Daniel was at my side. He had the expression of someone trying to hold himself together in public and not entirely succeeding. He said, "Mum, how did I not know this? Why didn't you tell me?" I told him the truth. I said that the longer you don't tell someone something, the more telling them feels like a confession. I said that the woman who'd lived in Osaka at 24 felt like a stranger to me now. And I said that Patrick had always been the one who made me feel like my whole history mattered, and that when I lost him, I suppose I'd also lost the person who remembered all of it with me. Daniel put his arm around me and I led him properly, instead of the usual brief and tidy hug. Kenji pulled out the chair next to him at the dinner table and indicated that I should sit there. His tone was light, but the gesture wasn't. He said he had a great many questions about Osaka and that dinner would be the right time for them. Saito seated himself across from Daniel and said, in careful English, that he appreciated the honesty he'd witnessed this evening. That in his line of work he met many people who presented the best version of a situation, and fewer people who were willing to correct a good impression rather than protect it. He said this was relevant information about character, about the family Daniel came from. We sat down to dinner. The conversation that followed was not what any of us had planned. We talked about Osaka and Kyoto and the particular politics of intercity rivalry that delighted Kenji and made Saito shake his head with something approaching fondness. Noriko asked me what it had been like to be a young Canadian woman alone in Japan in the 80s, and I told her stories I hadn't told anyone in years, stories Patrick had loved, and that I'd stopped telling because there was no one to tell them to. Yuki's father talked about his own history, arriving in Vancouver in his 20s with 2 suitcases and a job offer that fell through on the second day. Daniel and Saito talked about the engineering work with an ease and directness that had been absent earlier in the evening. At one point, Kenji asked me in Japanese whether I had been back to Osaka since I'd left. I told him not since I was 33. He said he thought it would surprise me, how much had changed and how much hadn't. That the Kuromon market was still there, still loud, still worth a full morning. That the light on the river in October was still the same. I told him I thought about it sometimes. He said I should stop thinking about it and go. As the evening wound down and coats were retrieved and taxis summoned, Saito found a moment to speak with me while Daniel was saying goodbye to Yuki's parents. He said, in Japanese, that he'd like to ask me something. I told him to go ahead. He said that his company's expansion into Canadian infrastructure projects had run into an unexpected challenge. Not the regulatory side, his Canadian lawyers managed that, but the relational side. The cultural texture of how business was done here, how trust was built, what Canadians expected from partners, how they communicated concerns indirectly, what certain silences meant. He said he had brought in consultants before, but they had always explained Canada from the outside, theoretically. He said it was clear I understood both perspectives from the inside. He said, "Would I be willing to have a conversation about a consulting arrangement?" I looked at him for a moment. I was aware that my coat was in my hands and that Daniel had appeared in the doorway and was watching us with an expression he was trying very hard to keep neutral. I said I'd never thought about that kind of work. He said that didn't surprise him, given that I'd been making a practice of not thinking about what I might offer. That landed. I said I'd like to think about it seriously, if he was making the offer seriously. He said he was. He said he would have his assistant send details within the week, and that he hoped I would look at them before deciding. He said, in the particularly direct way that I'd always appreciated about Kansai business culture, even when it made my students uncomfortable, that skilled people who talk themselves out of using their skills were a waste that he found difficult to watch. Daniel drove me home. We took the long way without discussing it, the way you do when a conversation is happening that neither person wants to rush. He said, somewhere on the QEW with the lake dark on our left, that he hadn't known. About Osaka. About how lonely I'd been. About any of it. He said he thought I was doing well and he'd wanted to believe it because it was easier. I told him I'd worked very hard to make it easy to believe. He said that was a terrible thing to have done to both of us. I said I knew. He said he wanted to fix it. Not just apologize and let things drift back to how they'd been. He said he wanted me at dinner on a regular basis. Not a special occasion, just dinner. He said Yuki had already texted him from inside the house, wanting to know if I'd consider teaching her some Japanese, because she'd always wanted to learn and never had a good reason to start. I looked out the window at the Ontario night. The highway lights and the dark stretch of Lake Ontario and the particular Canadian sky that I had missed, without knowing it, for every one of those 9 years I'd spent under a different one. I said I would very much like to teach Yuki Japanese. He said good. He said also that I had to stop disappearing, that he needed me to tell him when things were hard, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it felt like a burden. He said, and his voice did something complicated when he said it, that Dad would have said the same thing. That Dad would have wanted me to take up room, not shrink away. He was right. Patrick had always been the person who noticed when I was making myself small and quietly refused to let me. It had been 4 years since someone had refused to let me. That night, after Daniel dropped me off, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the African violet on the windowsill. The house was the same. The quiet was the same. But something had shifted in how I was sitting inside it, less like someone waiting for permission to be there, more like someone who lived there, who had things to do and places to be and a language stored in her head like good furniture that had been in storage too long. I found myself thinking about Osaka. The weight of summer air near the station. The sound of the dialect, fast and warm. Nothing like the language I'd studied in textbooks. The way I'd felt completely lost for 6 months and completely at home for 8.5 years. Kenji had said to stop thinking and go. Maybe. But first, dinner at Yuki and Daniel's on Sunday, and a conversation next week with Saito-san about what consulting might look like. And an African violet that needed repotting, which Patrick had never gotten around to and which I'd been putting off for no good reason except that doing it would mean accepting that no one was going to do it but me. I filled the kettle again and started looking up the right kind of soil. Silence has its uses. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. There's a version of quiet that's restful and considered, that gives other people room. But there's another version that's just fear in a respectable disguise, the fear of being a burden, of wanting too much, of taking up space that hasn't been explicitly offered. I had been practicing the second kind for 4 years and calling it consideration. I should have spoken up sooner, but sooner required knowing that I had something worth saying, and I think, possibly, I needed a room full of people speaking a language they assumed I didn't know before I was willing to disagree. I'm 63 years old. I lived 9 years in Osaka and 34 years with a man who thought I was remarkable, and somewhere in the grief of losing him I'd set all of that down and walked away from it like it belonged to someone else. It was mine all along. It had just been waiting, the way language does, the way the good parts of yourself do, patient in the back of your mind, ready for the moment you decide you'd like them back.